A millionaire witnessed a waitress being humiliated by her manager. Without hesitation, he stepped in to defend her, and by the end of the night, he made an impulsive decision. He took her home. But by morning, he was paralyzed with shock when he saw what she had done with his little daughter. The grand estate in Greenwich loomed in an unsettling silence, its vast halls bathed in the golden glow of chandeliers, their flickering lights reflecting off the cold marble floors. Every inch of Reece Bailey's mansion exuded wealth. Sleek luxury cars lined the pristine garage, an art collection rivaling those of the finest museums adorned the walls, and an expansive library stood filled with books he never had time to read. Yet, despite the grandeur, an undeniable hollowness clung to the air, as though the house itself mourned alongside its owner. Seated in a leather armchair in his private study, Reece swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. His gaze drifted past the towering windows to the distant city skyline, where New York's nightlights shimmered against the dark canvas of the sky. Outside, the world pulsed with life, oblivious to the grief that had turned his home into a mausoleum. Time moved forward for everyone else, but inside these walls, it had come to a standstill. 3 years had passed since Emmy died. 3 years since the accident that shattered his world. 3 years since laughter last echoed through these halls. Emmy had been his anchor, his one true love, and without her, he was adrift in an endless sea of loneliness. But, as devastating as his grief was, what truly broke him was watching his daughter, Lyra, slip further into silence. She had only been 5 when it happened, too young to fully grasp the weight of the tragedy, yet old enough for it to leave an irreversible scar. Once a bright, talkative child, Lyra had become a mere shadow of herself. She barely spoke, she rarely smiled. She spent most of her days curled up in her oversized armchair by the window, clutching the stuffed rabbit Emmy had given her on her last birthday, the final gift she had ever received from her mother. She would sit there for hours, lost in a world Reece could no longer reach, and that terrified him. A soft knock on the study door pulled him from his thoughts. Even before she spoke, he knew who it was. "Sir?" Gigila, the housekeeper who had served the family for over a decade, stepped inside with cautious hesitation. There was kindness in her eyes, but also worry. "She refused dinner again?" she said gently. Reece set his drink down, exhaling slowly. "That's the 3rd night in a row." He pushed himself up from the chair, running a tired hand through his hair. Julia hesitated. "Sir? She barely eats anything these days." "I know," he murmured, the weight of exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "I'll talk to her." But he wasn't sure anymore if he was trying for Lyra, or simply convincing himself that there was still a way to reach her. The walk through the mansion's long corridors felt heavier with each step, his footfalls echoing against the marble floors, a painful reminder of just how empty this house had become. When he reached Lyra's room, he found her exactly as he had expected. Curled up in her chair by the window, staring into the night. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting a silver glow on her delicate face, making her seem even smaller, even more fragile. "Lyra," he called softly, stepping closer. She didn't turn. He sighed and knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Julia told me you didn't eat again." Silence. Reece pulled up a small chair and sat beside her, leveling their gaze. He studied her face, searching desperately for a sign. Any sign that she was still in there, that she hadn't completely shut him out. "Do you remember how your mother used to tell you stories before bed?" he asked. "She always said stories could help when we were feeling sad." For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something stir in Lyra's eyes, a flicker of recognition, a sliver of hope. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, swallowed by the silence that had become her shield. His chest tightened. "I miss her too," he admitted, his voice quieter now, raw with emotion. Still, there was no response. Reece let out a slow breath, brushing a gentle hand over her soft curls before finally pulling away. "All right," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." And just like every other night, she didn't answer. Later that evening, as Reece sat alone in his study, staring blankly at the untouched files strewn across his desk, he felt the crushing weight of reality settle over him like an unbearable shroud. this was his life now, trapped in a house filled with ghosts of the past. A daughter slipping further and further from his grasp, and a silence so thick he could barely breathe through it. He couldn't stay here, the thought struck him suddenly, sharp and absolute, as though his body had decided before his mind could catch up. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and car keys. He didn't have a destination in mind, he only knew he needed to be anywhere but here. The drive through Manhattan was aimless, the city's neon lights flashing past in a blur of colors that barely registered. The streets were alive with people moving with purpose, caught up in the rhythm of their own lives, their own worries. But Reece had no direction, no plan, just the desperate need to clear his head. Then, almost instinctively, he pulled up in front of a small restaurant he'd never noticed before. It was nothing remarkable, modest, tucked between two larger buildings, its weathered sign illuminated by the warm glow of light spilling onto the sidewalk. Yet something about it caught him off guard. Maybe it was the faint hum of laughter drifting through the open door, or the way the golden light softened the edges of the night. Whatever it was, he parked, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. At that moment, he had no idea that this single, impulsive act would change everything. The restaurant was the kind of place where the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling butter clung to the air, wrapping around him like an embrace. It wasn't like the upscale establishments he was used to. There was no valet waiting at the curb, no polished silverware meticulously arranged on linen-draped tables, no overpriced entrees plated like museum exhibits. Instead, it was lively, brimming with an unpolished charm, the rhythmic clatter of silverware against plates, the murmur of casual conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from a table of friends lost in the joy of the moment. Reece almost turned around. This wasn't his kind of place, but something, perhaps the sheer normalcy of it, made him stay. He wasn't in the mood for luxury tonight. He was in the mood to feel something other than the suffocating emptiness that had followed him for far too long. A young hostess, barely out of her teens, greeted him with a polite smile before leading him to a quiet corner table. He slid into the seat, taking in his surrounding. The walls were adorned with old framed photographs of New York through the decades, and the restaurant was packed with customers. Couples on dates, families laughing over shared plates of pasta, old friends catching up over glasses of wine. There was life here, warmth, something that had been missing from his world for far too long. A waitress rushed past him, a tray balanced precariously in one hand as she weaved through the crowded space with practiced efficiency. But there was something about her, something in the tension of her shoulders, the exhaustion etched into her face, that caught his attention. She stopped at a nearby table to serve a couple. "Here you go, sir, a bourbon on the rocks," she said with a small apologetic smile. The man barely acknowledged her, already deep in conversation. "And for you, ma'am, the Chardonnay." As she set the glass down, the woman let out an exaggerated sigh. It's warm." The waitress flinched. "I'm so sorry. I can bring you another one." "Unbelievable," the woman huffed, rolling her eyes. "You'd think a place like this would at least know how to serve wine properly." Before the waitress could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. The entire restaurant seemed to pause for the briefest second. A middle-aged man in a too-tight dress shirt and a permanent scowl stormed toward the table. His posture, puffed-up chest, squared shoulders, made it clear he was the kind of man who thrived on authority, who relished in throwing his weight around. Reece watched as the waitress, Mikki, visibly tensed. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, her entire frame stiffening like she was bracing for impact. "How many times do I have to tell you to stop screwing up orders?" Clearly the manager snapped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence," he cut in, his voice rising. "You've been messing up all week. First the wrong appetizers, then the spilled soup, and now this. Do you think this is some kind of charity where we just let you do whatever you want?" Mikki's face turned red, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor, swallowing whatever protest she wanted to make. Reece could feel the discomfort in the room thickening. Other customers had paused their conversations, glancing over, some with mild curiosity, others with secondhand embarrassment for the girl being humiliated in the middle of the restaurant. Yet, no one said anything. They just watched, some entertained, some indifferent, as if this was nothing more than another piece of their evening's entertainment. Something inside Reece snapped. He set down his glass with a deliberate motion and stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. The manager turned, narrowing his eyes. "And who the hell are you?" Reece met his glare evenly. Someone who doesn't particularly enjoy watching people get humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. Mr. Lewis scoffed, unimpressed. "This is none of your business. She's my employee, and if she can't handle the job, she shouldn't be here." Reece took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "And you think screaming at her in public is good management?" Mikki looked up at him, her wide eyes flickering with a mix of emotions: shock, uncertainty, and something else. Relief, maybe, or disbelief that someone had actually spoken up for her. "Mr. Lewis," the manager folded his arms tightly across his chest, his irritation palpable. "Look, sir, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Reece Bailey," he interrupted smoothly. The name alone made the man falter. Recognition flashed in his eyes, quickly followed by a flicker of unease. Reece let that moment stretch just long enough before speaking again. "I don't run a restaurant, but I do run businesses, successful ones, and I can tell you this, no real leader treats their employees like garbage and expects them to perform well." Mr. Lewis clenched his jaw, his face darkening, but he didn't argue. He had already lost whatever authority he thought he had. "Apologize," Reece said, his voice even but edged with quiet command. For a long, tense beat, the manager hesitated, looking as though he wanted to protest, but he was outmatched, and he knew it. With a tight expression, he turned to Mikki. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Mikki blinked, stunned. "That didn't sound particularly sincere," Reece mused, tilting his head slightly. Lewis exhaled through his nose, his frustration barely contained. "I'm sorry, Mikki," he said again, this time with more effort. Reece studied him for a moment before giving a slight nod. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to order dinner, and I expect to be served by her." The manager's expression twisted as if he had swallowed something sour, but he gave a stiff nod before turning and storming toward the kitchen. Mikki stood frozen, as if still trying to process what had just happened. "Are you okay?" Reece asked, his tone gentler now. She let out a breathless, almost incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "That was unexpected." Reece smirked. "So was this restaurant, for the first time tonight." Mikki smiled faintly. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment their fates quietly intertwined. She could still feel the heat of humiliation burning on her skin, even though Mr. Lewis had disappeared. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her notepad, forcing herself to focus on something, anything, to keep her composure. She had been yelled at before, insulted, belittled, but this time had been different. This time someone had stepped in. She glanced at Reece Bailey, who was still watching her with that unreadable expression. She knew his name. Who didn't? His face had been on magazine covers. His company, Bailey & Co., was one of the most powerful in the finance world. What was a man like him doing in a place like this? And more importantly, why had he defended her? "Are you sure you still want me to serve you?" she asked dryly, sarcasm creeping into her tone. "I might get your order wrong and end up on the street." A smirk tugged at the corner of Reece's lips. "I like to live dangerously." Despite herself, she let out a small, reluctant laugh. The tension in her shoulders loosened slightly, though the embarrassment still lingered. "Steak, medium rare. Glass of red," he said simply. "Efficient." "Just like the man himself," she supposed. She nodded, turning away without another word, feeling his gaze linger on her back as she walked toward the kitchen. The rest of her shift dragged on, but at least Mr. Lewis left her alone. Whether it was out of fear that Reece might make more trouble for him, or because he had simply lost interest, she didn't care. All she wanted was to survive the night, collect her meager tips, and figure out what to do about her rapidly crumbling life. By the time she finished cleaning her last table, her body ached with exhaustion. Her shift was over, but the weight of reality pressed heavily against her. She had nowhere to go. 2 weeks ago, she had been evicted from her tiny apartment, the one she had barely been able to afford. Since then, she had bounced between dingy motels and sleeping in the restaurant's break room whenever Mr. Lewis wasn't paying attention. She kept telling herself it was temporary, that she'd find a way out. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. As she pulled off her apron and grabbed her coat, she turned to find Reece still seated at his table. His plate was empty, his wine glass nearly drained, but he wasn't in a hurry to leave. Instead, he was watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with an expression that suggested he was still, thinking about what had happened earlier. She hesitated, then walked over. Crossing her arms, she raised an eyebrow. Do billionaires usually spend their nights rescuing waitresses? Reece leaned back slightly, considering her. No, tonight was a first. Mikki let out a small huff of laughter. Lucky me. His gaze flickered briefly to the worn-out coat in her hands, the tired slump of her shoulders, the dark circles under her eyes. He didn't know her, but he had spent enough time around people to recognize when someone was barely holding it together. Do you have a ride home? He asked. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated just a second too long before forcing a nod. Yeah, I'll manage. Reece didn't look convinced. Where do you live? Why do you care? There was no bite to her words, only guardedness. The kind of reflexive defense built from years of learning not to trust easily. Because you look like you're about to walk into the night with nowhere to go, he said simply. Mikki felt her throat tighten. Damn it, why did he have to be so perceptive? I'm fine, she lied, shoving her hands deep into her coat pockets as if that could shield her from the truth. Reece sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure why he cared, but he did. Maybe it was the way she had stood there, taking hit after hit from her boss without so much as raising her voice. Not because she was weak, but because she was exhausted. Maybe it was because, in some way, she reminded him of someone he once knew, someone who had been full of fire until life had burned it out of her. Do you have anywhere to stay tonight? He asked, more directly this time. Mikki didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was enough. Reece exhaled, then said the words before he could talk himself out of them. Come with me. Her eyes snapped to his. What? I have a guest house. It's warm, quiet, and no one will scream at you for pouring a warm glass of wine. Mikki narrowed her eyes, searching his face. Are you in the habit of bringing stray waitresses home? Reece let out a short chuckle. Just this once. She kept staring, trying to find an ulterior motive, some unspoken expectation lurking beneath his offer. She had spent enough time around men to recognize hunger in their gaze, the silent demand for something in return. But Reece, he wasn't looking at her like that. His expression held no expectation, no hidden agenda, just patience. Why? She asked, her voice quieter now. Because you need help. He met her eyes without hesitation. And because I can help. It's that simple for me. Mikki wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she'd be fine, that she'd figure it out like she always had, that she didn't need some rich man's pity. But she was tired. So tired. And for the first time in a long time, someone was offering kindness without asking for anything in return. She swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay. A part of her couldn't believe she had just agreed to this, but another part, the one that was exhausted from fighting every battle alone, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance she was meant to take. Reece signaled for the check, paid without hesitation, and led her outside. The night air was crisp, biting at her exposed skin, but for the first time in a long time, Mikki didn't feel completely lost. She had no idea that by stepping into Reece Bailey's car, she wasn't just accepting a ride home. She was stepping into something far bigger than she could have imagined. A fate that had been waiting for her all along. The drive to Greenwich was silent. Mikki sat in the passenger seat of Reece's sleek black car, her fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her worn-out coat, as if holding onto something familiar could keep her grounded. The heated leather seat beneath her was a stark contrast to the cold night outside, and the smooth hum of the engine only made her more aware of how out of place she felt. She didn't know where this road would lead her, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking it alone. Reece drove with the kind of effortless confidence that came from years of always being in control, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said much since they left the restaurant, and Mikki wasn't sure if she was grateful for the silence or unsettled by it. She had no idea what she was doing. Accepting help from a man she had just met, a billionaire no less, wasn't something she did. She had spent years surviving on her own, scraping by without anyone to lean on. Letting someone, especially a stranger, step in and offer her even the smallest reprieve felt unnatural. And yet, here she was. The car eventually turned onto a long, winding driveway lined with towering trees. Their bare branches stretched out against the glow of the streetlights, casting long skeletal shadows across the pavement. Mikki's breath hitched slightly as the mansion came into view. It wasn't just big, it was massive. She had seen wealth before, had served people with money, but this was something else entirely. The house stood tall and elegant, its grand windows reflecting the warm glow of the interior lights. It wasn't ostentatious or excessive, yet it exuded a quiet, intimidating grandeur, refined, immaculate, and utterly foreign to her world. Reece pulled up near the entrance and cut the engine. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Come on." He stepped out without another word. Mikki hesitated, fingers curling around the worn fabric of her coat, before reluctantly following him. The cold night air nipped at her skin as she stepped onto the stone pathway leading to the front door. The moment they stepped inside, warmth enveloped her. The interior was just as impressive as she had expected. Soaring ceilings, polished hardwood floors, walls adorned with artwork that probably cost more than she'd ever make in her lifetime. And yet, despite its beauty, there was something hollow about the space, as if the house itself had been stripped of whatever had once made it a home. A woman appeared from the hallway, her expression mildly surprised but not unwelcoming. She looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in a neat uniform, her graying hair pulled back into a tight bun. "Mr. Bailey," she greeted, her voice warm but professional. Her gaze flickered to Mikki, curiosity evident but unspoken. "This is Mikki," Reece said, his tone casual yet firm. "She'll be staying in the guest house tonight." Mikki tensed. The woman, who Mikki assumed was the housekeeper, didn't react with judgment, only a small nod of acknowledgement. "Of course, I'll have it prepared right away." Mikki shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to be a bother." "You're not," Reece said simply, then glanced at the housekeeper. "Julia, could you bring her something to eat?" Mikki shook her head. "That's really not necessary." Reece arched a brow. "When was the last time you ate?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Exactly." Julia gave a knowing smile. "I'll bring something from the kitchen." Mikki sighed, a mixture of gratitude and unease settling in her chest. She wasn't used to kindness, not like this, not without a catch. Before she could process the weight of it, a soft sound caught her attention. Footsteps. She turned just in time to see a small figure at the top of the grand staircase peeking over the railing. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, dressed in pale pink pajamas, her long, wavy brown hair cascading over her shoulders. She clutched a well-loved stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest, her fingers gripping the fabric as if it were a lifeline. But it was her eyes, large, round, eerily familiar, that made Mikki freeze. Because they weren't just watching her, they were studying her. And for the first time that night, Mikki felt something other than exhaustion settle deep in her bones. She felt like she had just stepped into something she didn't understand. Something much bigger than herself. Mikki felt her breath hitch. Reece followed her gaze, his posture shifting ever so slightly. "Lyra?" he called gently. The little girl hesitated at the top of the stairs before slowly descending, her bare feet tapping softly against the polished wood. She stopped a few feet away, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly, her large eyes locked onto Mikki. Mikki wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't great with kids, had never really been around them, but there was something about the way Lyra was looking at her, curious, cautious, but not afraid, that made her chest tighten. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to the girl's level. "Hi, Lyra." Silence. Lyra just stared. Reece sighed. "She doesn't talk much." Mikki glanced at him before turning back to the little girl. "That's okay," she said lightly. "I'm not much of a talker either." For a moment there was nothing but stillness. Then, so subtly it was almost imperceptible, Lyra took a tiny step forward. Mikki remained perfectly still, careful not to startle her. The little girl hesitated before lifting her stuffed rabbit ever so slightly, as if showing it to her. Mikki's smile softened. "That's a cute rabbit. What's its name again?" No response. But Lyra didn't retreat, didn't shy away. "I had a stuffed bear when I was little. His name was Charlie. He was my best friend." Something flickered across Lyra's face. Interest, maybe? Recognition? And then, to Mikki's utter surprise, Lyra did something that Reece hadn't seen her do in years. She giggled. It was small, barely more than a soft exhale, but it was real. Reece went still. Mikki blinked. Did you just laugh? Lyra clutched her rabbit tighter, as if she hadn't meant to let the sound escape, but the corners of her mouth twitched just slightly, and Mikki felt something deep inside her chest tighten in response. Reece was still staring, his expression unreadable, as if he had just seen a ghost. For years he had tried everything: therapy, specialists, books on childhood trauma, desperately searching for a way to bring Lyra back. And yet here was this woman, a complete stranger, standing in his house for less than 10 minutes, and she had done the impossible. She had made his daughter laugh. Mikki, still crouched before Lyra, felt a strange warmth settle inside her. She didn't understand why this little girl had reacted to her, why she seemed at ease in a way she clearly wasn't with others. But in that moment, as Lyra hesitated before stepping just a little closer, Mikki realized something. She wasn't just here for a place to sleep tonight. Something bigger was happening, something she didn't understand yet, something that would change everything. Reece stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat as he watched Lyra linger near Mikki. It was surreal. His daughter, the same little girl who had spent the last 3 years trapped in her silence, who had refused to let anyone in since Emmy's death, had just laughed. It was small, quiet, but undeniable. And it was because of Mikki he wasn't sure what to make of that. Mikki, still crouched, met Lyra's gaze with warmth. Without forcing anything, without trying to push, she simply existed in the moment with her, allowing Lyra to come to her at her own pace. The little girl hesitated, then carefully lifted her stuffed rabbit and pressed it gently against Mikki's arm, as if offering it to her. Mikki blinked, tilting her head. "For me?" Lyra hesitated again, then gave a tiny nod. Reece almost stepped forward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It wasn't that he didn't believe in progress, it was that he had stopped expecting it. Mikki took the rabbit with exaggerated reverence, inspecting it as if it were the most precious thing she had ever held. "Wow," she murmured. "He's really soft, and he looks well-loved." Lyra's lips pressed together, as if holding back another small smile. Reece cleared his throat. "Lyra, it's late. You should get some sleep." The little girl didn't look at him. Instead, she kept her gaze on Mikki. Mikki smiled and handed the stuffed rabbit back. "Good night, Lyra." For a moment it looked like Lyra might say something. But then, without a word, she turned and padded back up the stairs, hugging the rabbit tightly to her chest. Mikki slowly stood, watching Lyra disappear down the hall before turning to Reece. "She's incredible," she murmured. Reece let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. "You have no idea." Julia, who had quietly returned from the kitchen, broke the moment. "There's some food ready for you, dear." Mikki hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Reece motioned for her to follow, leading her down a corridor toward a smaller, cozier dining area, a stark contrast to the grand, formal one that he rarely used. A plate of steaming pasta sat on the table, accompanied by a glass of water and a neatly folded napkin. Mikki slid into the chair, glancing up at him warily. "You really didn't have to do all this." Reece pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. "I don't do things I don't want to do." She scoffed lightly, twirling her fork into the pasta. "Right. Billionaire rule of thumb, I'm guessing? Something like that?" He didn't respond, just watched as she took her first hesitant bite. The way she closed her eyes briefly, exhaling softly, as if the warmth of the food seeped into her very bones, didn't go unnoticed. "How long has it been since you had a real meal?" he asked. Mikki swallowed, then shrugged. "Depends on what you consider real." Reece didn't press her for more. He already knew the answer. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the soft clinking of silverware the only sound between them. Then, finally, Mikki set down her fork and leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze with a quiet curiosity. "Okay," she said. "What's your deal?" Reece raised a brow. "My deal?" She gestured vaguely. "A rich, powerful man takes in a struggling waitress, gives her food, offers her a place to stay? It sounds like the beginning of a very specific kind of story." He smirked. "And what kind of story do you think this is? The kind where people expect something in return?" Mikki studied him, searching for cracks in his composure, for any sign of an ulterior motive, but all she saw was calm certainty. "I don't," he added, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. She exhaled, shaking her head. "Okay, let's say I believe that." "You should?" She let out a quiet laugh. "You really are a billionaire, aren't you?" "I've been told." Mikki tilted her head, studying him. "So why are you doing this?" Reece considered his answer for a moment before speaking. "Because my daughter just laughed. For the first time in 3 years." Mikki's smile faded slightly. He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "She doesn't do that. She barely speaks, barely reacts. And yet tonight, with you?" He trailed off, inhaling deeply before finishing. "She came alive." Mikki swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of what had happened. "I don't know why." "I don't either," Reece admitted. "But for some reason, Lyra connected with you in a way she hasn't with anyone else." Mikki shifted uncomfortably, looking away. "Maybe it was just a fluke." "Maybe," he said, "but I can't ignore it." She hesitated, staring down at her hands. "What are you asking?" Reece exhaled. "Stay." Her head snapped up. "What? Stay. Stay here, at least for a little while. You don't have to work for me. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Just be here. Be around Lyra." Mikki's pulse quickened. "That's insane." "Is it?" She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I don't know anything about kids. I've never been a nanny." "I'm not asking you to be a nanny," Reece said gently. "I'm asking you to be you. Because whoever you are, whatever it is about you that made Lyra laugh tonight, that's something I can't ignore." Mikki stared at him, her mind racing. Every instinct she had told her to say no, to run, to not get involved, and yet she had seen Lyra's face. She had seen that tiny, hesitant spark of joy, and she had felt something deep and unfamiliar, stir inside her when it happened, something she didn't want to walk away from. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You're really serious about this?" Reece nodded. Mikki closed her eyes for a moment, weighing the decision. Then, finally, she opened them and met his gaze. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." And just like that, a door had been opened. One she couldn't close. One that would change both of their lives forever. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the guest house, casting golden streaks across the plush carpet and the neatly made bed. For the first time in weeks, Mikki had slept through the night, without waking up cold and restless, without the gnawing anxiety of wondering where she'd sleep the next day or how she'd scrape together enough money for a cheap motel or a bus ride to nowhere. She stretched, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of warmth and comfort wrapping around her like a foreign embrace, then immediately shook it off. "This isn't my life. This isn't my world. It was just temporary." Repeating the thought like a mantra, she pulled on a fresh change of clothes from the small duffel bag she had brought with her, one of the few things she still owned after losing her apartment. Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her hoodie, its frayed edges a stark contrast to the polished elegance that surrounded her. The guest house itself was bigger than any place she had ever lived, with its high ceilings, gleaming wooden floors, and carefully curated decor that looked like it belonged in a luxury home magazine. It felt surreal, like stepping into a life that didn't belong to her. And then there was the man himself, Reece Bailey. She still wasn't sure what to make of him. He was guarded, controlled, the kind of man who carried himself with an air of effortless authority. And yet, last night, when he had spoken about Lyra, there had been something raw in his eyes, something unguarded, vulnerable. He wasn't just some billionaire throwing money at a problem. He was a father, desperate to reach his daughter. And for some reasons Mikki still didn't understand, Lyra had responded to her. That alone was enough to make her uneasy. She wasn't a miracle worker. She wasn't anyone special. So why did she feel like she had just stepped into something much bigger than herself? A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Mikki hesitated before crossing the room and opening it. Julia stood on the other side, holding a neatly arranged breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear," she greeted with a kind smile. "I thought you might like something to eat before heading inside." Mikki blinked. "Inside?" "The main house. Mr. Bailey is expecting you, isn't he? You did agree to stay. Mikki forced a polite smile and took the tray, balancing it carefully. Thank you, but I could have come to the kitchen. You didn't have to. Nonsense, Julia interrupted with a gentle wave of her hand. Her guest here. Mikki bit her tongue. She wasn't sure what she was, but she knew she wasn't just a guest. Guests didn't arrive at mansions with nowhere else to go. Still, she murmured her thanks and set the tray down, watching as Julia excused herself, leaving her alone once more. 15 minutes later, she found herself walking toward the main house, the crisp morning air cooling her skin. The front door was already open when she reached it. She hesitated briefly before stepping inside. She hadn't taken a good look at the place the night before, too exhausted to absorb much, but now, in the daylight, she couldn't ignore its sheer grandeur. The towering ceilings, the intricate detailing on the walls, the expensive paintings, the perfectly arranged furniture. Everything was pristine, carefully maintained. Yet, despite its beauty, there was something lifeless about it. Mikki wondered if that was how Reece felt too. She was still glancing around when she heard the soft, rapid patter of footsteps from down the hallway. A second later, Lyra appeared. Her stuffed rabbit was clutched tightly against her chest, her large eyes locked onto Mikki with the same quiet intensity from the night before. Mikki paused. The little girl didn't speak, she just stared. Then, to Mikki's surprise, Lyra took a step closer, and then another, until she was standing just a few feet away, watching her as if trying to solve a puzzle. Mikki crouched slightly, lowering herself to the girl's level. "Morning, kiddo." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she lifted the rabbit in her arms, holding it out to Mikki the same way she had the night before. Mikki smiled. "Still taking care of him, huh?" Lyra nodded. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed the rabbit in Mikki's hands. Mikki blinked. "You're letting me borrow him?" Another small nod. A lump formed in Mikki's throat. She wasn't sure why. Before she could say anything else, Reece's voice came from down the hall. "Lyra," he called. The girl quickly stepped back, her expression unreadable. A second later, Reece appeared, his gaze flickering between them before settling on his daughter. He looked almost cautious, as if afraid of disturbing whatever fragile connection was forming between them. He knelt beside Lyra, his voice softer now. "Julia made pancakes. Do you want some?" For a moment, Lyra didn't move. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, her small frame disappearing down the hall with slow, deliberate steps. Reece exhaled, straightening as he looked at Mikki. She's never done that before. Never approached someone first. He held out the stuffed rabbit to her. Mikki hesitated, then took it, fingers pressing gently into the worn fabric. "It's just a rabbit." "No, it's not," Reece murmured. They stood there for a beat, the air charged with something unspoken. Then, as if shaking himself free from a thought, Reece gestured toward the dining room. "Come eat, we need to talk." Mikki followed, unsure of what conversation awaited her, but knowing, deep down, that whatever it was, it mattered. She had stepped into something she didn't understand, and there was no turning back now. The walk through the long, elegant hallway felt heavier than it should have. The mansion, with all its wealth and refinement, still felt oddly empty, like a place meant to be lived in, yet somehow frozen in time, stuck in a past no one wanted to talk about. When they entered the dining room, the scent of maple syrup and butter filled the air. Julia had already set the table, plates of pancakes, fresh fruit, and steaming cups of coffee arranged with quiet care. The warmth of it all, the simple domesticity, was almost disorienting. Reece took his usual place at the head of the table, his movements composed as ever. Lyra was already in her chair, her small feet swinging beneath the table as she cautiously nibbled on a piece of fruit. Mikki's gaze lingered on the little girl, still clutching the stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation. That alone was unsettling. Mikki took a slow breath before pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Coffee?" Reece asked, his voice even. She nodded, and Julia poured her a cup. The rich aroma filled her senses as she wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic. It had been a long time since she'd had a meal like this, since anyone had served her anything. The last time she had been a kid, sitting at a tiny, wobbly kitchen table with her mother. the two of them sharing a single plate of eggs and toast because that was all they could afford. And now, here she was, eating pancakes on fine china across from one of the richest men in the city. It felt surreal. Reece cut into his food with quiet precision, not speaking at first. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just weighted, as if both of them were trying to figure out where they stood. Finally, he glanced at her. "You slept well?" Mikki hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." A pause. Then, more honestly, "Better than I have in a while." She didn't know why, but it was the truth. Reece nodded slightly, as if filing that information away. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You don't have to sit here if you don't want to." Mikki frowned. "What?" "If eating with us makes you uncomfortable, Julia can set up something for you in the guest house." Her expression tightened. "Why would it make me uncomfortable?" Reece tilted his head slightly. "Because you don't like feeling like you owe anyone anything." Mikki blinked. He wasn't wrong. She exhaled, setting her fork down. "Look, I appreciate the food and the place to sleep, but let's be clear. I don't expect this to be permanent." Reece's gaze didn't waver. "I never said it had to be." Mikki narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to read him. He was hard to pin down, a man who kept everything close to his chest, revealing only what he wanted others to see. "So, why am I here?" she asked finally. "What do you really want from me?" Reece leaned back in his chair, unreadable as ever. "I already told you." Mikki scoffed, shaking her head. "Yeah, I know." Lyra laughed. She glanced at the little girl who was still quietly picking at her breakfast. "But you're acting like I'm some kind of—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Reece didn't hesitate. "I think you're someone my daughter is responding to." Mikki let out a slow breath. "You keep saying that, but I don't know why. I don't know anything about kids, Reece. I've never taken care of one, never even been around them much. And yet Lyra lets you near her." Mikki's gaze flickered back to the little girl, watching as she carefully arranged pieces of fruit into small patterns on her plate. "She's a kid," Mikki muttered. "Maybe I was just new and interesting for a night." "Maybe," Reece agreed, "but I can't take that chance." Mikki looked at him, searching his face. "And what happens if it stops? If she wakes up tomorrow and doesn't want me around anymore? If she doesn't laugh again?" Reece exhaled, his fingers drumming lightly against his coffee cup. "Then at least I'll know I tried." His honesty caught Mikki off guard. He wasn't pretending to have all the answers. He wasn't trying to convince her that this was some grand, well-thought-out plan with a guaranteed outcome. He was just a father grasping at whatever hope he could find, and for some reason, that was harder to walk away from than she had expected. Mikki swallowed hard. "You really love her, don't you?" Reece's expression softened. "Just barely. But it was enough. More than anything, it was enough." Mikki looked away, feeling something unfamiliar twist in her chest. She didn't know what it was like to have a father who would do anything for her. She didn't know what it was like to be someone's first priority. And yet, sitting here, watching the way Reece looked at Lyra, with so much quiet devotion in his eyes, she felt something she wasn't sure she wanted to name. Suddenly, a small tug on her sleeve made her turn. "Lyra?" The little girl pointed at her plate, then at Mikki's, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to form words. Mikki frowned. "You want me to eat more?" Lyra nodded. Mikki blinked, surprised. Then, despite herself, she let out a soft chuckle. "Bossy," she muttered, picking up her fork again. On across the table, Reece watched the exchange, something close to relief flickering in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, there was movement, however small, in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely drowning in hopelessness. Mikki didn't know why she had agreed to stay. She didn't know what she was doing here, sitting in a mansion, eating breakfast with people who existed in a world so far removed from her own. But what she did know, what she was slowly beginning to accept, was that something about this felt right, and that terrified her more than anything else. The day stretched on in a way Mikki hadn't anticipated. She had expected to feel out of place, awkward in a house filled with quiet luxury, but instead there was an odd stillness that settled around her. It wasn't peace. Peace was something she had never really known, but it was the closest she had felt to it in years. After breakfast, Reece had disappeared into his office, leaving Mikki alone with Lyra, which had been unexpected. She wasn't sure if he had done it on purpose, testing some theory he had about Lyra's sudden connection to her, or if he was simply trusting her. Either way, she found herself sitting on the living room floor, watching as Lyra carefully lined up a set of colored pencils in perfect order. Mikki pulled her knees to her chest. "You're really into making things neat, huh?" Lyra glanced up at her, then looked back down at her arrangement, nudging a blue pencil just a fraction of an inch to the right. Mikki smirked. "Perfectionist, got it." Lyra didn't respond, but she also didn't move away. That alone felt like a win. It was strange how easily Mikki had settled into this quiet rhythm with Lyra. She had never spent much time around kids, had never thought of herself as the kind of person who knew how to talk to them, and yet there was something about this little girl, the way she observed the world with such quiet caution, the way she existed in a space without demanding to be seen, that made Mikki want to understand her. Julia passed by the room, watching the scene unfold with mild amusement. She didn't say anything, but Mikki could sense the quiet approval in her gaze. Later in the afternoon, after Lyra had retreated upstairs for a nap, Mikki found herself wandering toward the back of the house, drawn to the massive windows overlooking the sprawling garden. She pressed a hand against the cool glass, exhaling softly as she took in the view. The place was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was lonely. She wondered if it had always been this way or if it had only become like this after Emmy's death. The thought sent an unexpected pang through her chest. She didn't know much about Reece's late wife, only what she had pieced together from brief mentions and the weight that seemed to settle over him whenever Lyra was brought up. But she knew grief when she saw it. And Reece Bailey carried his like a permanent scar. Mikki turned away from the window, shaking off the thought. "It's not my business." As she made her way down the hallway, she passed by Reece's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear his voice, low and measured. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something in his tone made her stop. "I don't care how long it takes," he said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "Find out everything." A pause, then more clipped, more deliberate. "Yes? Her mother? I want the full report." Mikki felt her stomach twist. Her mother? A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back before she could hear anything else, her pulse quickening as she hurried down the hall. Why? Would Reece be investigating my mother? It didn't make sense. He had no reason to, unless... Mikki stopped abruptly, pressing a hand against her temple. "I'm overthinking this. He was a businessman. A man used to controlling his environment, to knowing exactly who was in his house around his daughter. Maybe he was just being cautious, making sure I wasn't a threat before letting me near Lyra. That would make sense. And yet, something about it didn't sit right. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to keep walking, shoving down the unease curling in her stomach. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in her head. She hadn't thought about her mother in a long time. Not because she had forgotten her, how could she? But because thinking about her always led to the same ache in her chest, the same unanswered questions. She had been young when she lost her. Too young to understand why things had happened the way they did, why her mother had left that night and never come back. The official story had been an accident. A tragic, untimely death, but the truth? Mikki had always felt that there was more to it, and now, hearing Reece say her mother's name like a puzzle he was trying to solve, she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something she didn't. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to ask. Not yet. But sooner or later, she wouldn't have a choice. The morning felt different. Maybe it was the weight of what she had overheard, or maybe it was the unsettling feeling that she was walking, blindfolded, into something much bigger than she could comprehend. Either way, when she stepped into the main house, there was a tightness in her chest that hadn't been there the day before. Reece was already at the dining table, sipping his coffee as he skimmed through a document, his usual air of quiet authority settling over the room. Julia moved effortlessly between the kitchen and the table, setting down fresh fruit and warm toast with the practiced grace of someone who had done this for years. And then there was Lyra, curled up in her chair, absently twirling the edge of the tablecloth between her fingers. She wasn't eating much, but she wasn't completely withdrawn either. That was progress. Mikki slid into the seat across from her eyes flickering to Reece. He looked up briefly, offering a polite nod, but there was something else in his gaze. Something unreadable. She hesitated before speaking. "Busy morning?" "Always," he replied, setting his paper aside. "You?" Mikki shrugged, reaching for a piece of toast, still trying to get used to waking up in a house that didn't smell like burnt coffee and regret. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Heya, Julia makes a better breakfast than your old place, I take it?" "Oh, absolutely." She took a bite, chewing slowly before glancing at Lyra. "What about you, kiddo? You like Julia's cooking?" Lyra looked up at her, blinking those large, curious eyes. Then, after a beat, she gave the smallest nod. Mikki smiled. "Good, 'cause I was starting to think she was feeding me the fancy stuff and giving you the boring stuff." A flicker of amusement crossed Lyra's face, barely there, but enough to make Mikki's chest tighten. Across the table, Reece observed the interaction silently, something shifting in his expression. He didn't say anything, but for the first time in a long time, there was movement, however small, in the right direction, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely drowning in hopelessness. Mikki waited until breakfast was over, waited until Julia had taken Lyra upstairs to get dressed for the day, waited until she was alone with Reece. Then, finally, she spoke. "Are you always in the habit of investigating people who stay in your guest house?" Reece didn't look surprised. If anything, he seemed like he had been expecting the question. "I like to know who's around my daughter," he said simply. Mikki crossed her arms. "That's not what you were looking into." Reece studied her for a moment before exhaling, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "No, it's not." Mikki's pulse quickened. "Then what?" Silence. "Why were you asking about my mother?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of hesitation, caution. "I had my reasons," he said. Mikki clenched her jaw. "That's not an answer." Reece leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Do you trust me?" The question caught her off guard. Her instinct was to say no, to remind him that she barely knew him, that trust wasn't something she handed out easily. But then she thought about Lyra, about the way he looked at his daughter, about the way he was trying so desperately to bring her back from whatever dark place she had disappeared into. And she realized, despite everything, despite all the unanswered questions, she did trust him, at least a little. She let out a slow breath. "I don't know yet." Reece nodded, as if that answer was enough for now. "I'm looking into something," he admitted, "something I don't fully understand yet. And when I do, I'll tell you." Mikki frowned. "Why not now?" "Because I don't have the full truth yet," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I don't want to give you half of a story." She hated that answer, hated the way it left her dangling between knowing and not knowing, between trust and suspicion, but she also knew he wasn't going to budge. "Fine," she muttered, pushing back her chair. "But just so you know, if you find something and you don't tell me." She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I walk." Reece didn't flinch. "Fair enough." The tension between them was thick, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Mikki turned, ready to leave, ready to put distance between herself and the questions clawing at the back of her mind. But just as she reached the doorway, a voice, soft and barely above a whisper, stopped her. "Mikki," she froze. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned. Lyra stood at the top of the stairs, her small fingers gripping the railing, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her arm. She hesitated for a second, then with a quiet certainty, she took a step forward and spoke the single word that changed everything. "Stay." The single word was barely there, so soft that Mikki almost wasn't sure she had heard it. But the way Reece's eyes widened, the way his entire body seemed to still, told her she hadn't imagined it. Mikki swallowed. She didn't know what was happening here. She didn't know what she had walked into or what part she was supposed to play in all of this, but as she looked at Lyra, at the hesitant, uncertain hope in those wide, searching eyes, she realized something. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to walk away after all. Mikki had never been one to freeze up, but something about hearing Lyra say her name, hearing her speak at all, made her feel as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. This little girl had barely made a sound in 3 years, Yet here she was, standing at the top of the stairs, looking at her with quiet determination, asking her to stay. Mikki wasn't sure how long she stood there, stunned, but when she finally found her voice, it was softer than she expected. "I'm here, kiddo." Lyra didn't move, but her grip on the railing relaxed just slightly, as if those words had been enough to settle something inside her. Reece remained silent, watching the interaction with a carefully controlled expression. But Mikki could feel the tension rolling off him. This moment, this fragile, unexpected breakthrough, was something he hadn't dared to hope for. She swallowed, trying to ground herself in reality. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't trained for this. But somehow, Lyra had let her in. Somehow, this little girl had cracked open the shell she had spent years building. And Mikki had no idea what to do with that. Before she could say anything else, Julia appeared at the top of the stairs, placing a gentle hand on Lyra's shoulder. "Why don't we go get dressed, sweetheart?" she said softly. "Mikki will still be here when you come back down." Lyra hesitated, glancing between Julia and Mikki, then finally nodded before turning and walking down the hallway. Mikki let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When she finally turned to Reece, his gaze was locked onto her, unreadable yet intense. "You understand what just happened, don't you?" he asked. Mikki crossed her arms, shifting her weight. She said, "My name?" Reece shook his head slightly. "No." His voice was quieter now. "I asked you to stay." Something about the way he said it made Mikki's chest tighten. She swallowed hard. "It doesn't mean anything," she said quickly. "She hadn't spoken in 3 years, Reece, I know. But maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe she's just comfortable around me for now." Reece exhaled, leaning against the back of one of the dining chairs. "You don't have to do this." Mikki's head snapped up. "Do what? Stay?" His voice remained calm, but there was something deeper in it. Something uncertain. "I told you I wouldn't force anything. You don't owe me or her anything." Mikki let out a dry chuckle, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah, tell that to her." They both knew Lyra had just made things infinitely more complicated. Mikki had spent her whole life knowing how to walk away. It was a survival instinct. She didn't form attachments because attachments could be taken away, and yet here she was, standing on the edge of something she couldn't walk back from. She let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. Reece studied her for a moment before responding. "Neither do I." There was something raw in his voice, something that made her stomach twist. Mikki turned away, walking toward the large window, staring out at the quiet landscape. The estate stretched endlessly before her, an expanse of manicured perfection that only made her feel more like she didn't belong. "This isn't my world," she muttered, more to herself than to him. She felt him move closer, not too close, but close enough. "Neither is mine," he said after a moment. "Not anymore." Mikki frowned, turning slightly. "What do you mean?" Reece's expression darkened just slightly. A flicker of something he quickly pushed back down. "This house, this life," he said carefully. "It isn't the same without Emmy. Lyra doesn't respond to this place the way she used to. She doesn't respond to anyone." He paused. Then added, quieter, almost like an admission, "Until you..." Mikki's throat tightened. "I don't know why," she murmured. "Neither do I." They stood in silence, the weight of everything settling between them. Finley Reece ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping just slightly. "Look, I meant what I said. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But if you do decide to stay, I need you to understand something." Mikki turned fully, meeting his gaze. He exhaled. "If you leave now, before she gets too attached, maybe it won't hurt her." He hesitated, then added, "But if you stay and then walk away later, after she's already let you in," his voice trailed off, but she knew exactly what he was saying. Mikki clenched her jaw, looking away. "You think I'm going to hurt her?" Reece's voice remained quiet, steady. "I think that if you don't know what you want, you shouldn't make her believe you do." That stung. Mikki wanted to snap back, to tell him he had no right to put this on her, to make her feel like she was responsible for something she had never asked for. But the truth was, she did feel responsible. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to calm down. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Reece." Neither do I, he admitted. But Lyra does. That hit harder than she wanted to admit. Because he was right. Lyra wasn't the one overthinking everything, questioning motives, second-guessing emotions. She was just a little girl, lost in the dark for far too long, who, for some reason, had reached for her. And Mikki? Mikki didn't know how to walk away from that. A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "I'll stay." Reece didn't react at first. He simply studied her, as if making sure she wasn't saying it just to appease him. Then finally, he nodded. Okay, it wasn't a binding contract. It wasn't a permanent agreement, but it was a start. And as Mikki stood there, feeling the weight of her decision settle into place, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she had just made a choice that wasn't solely about survival. It was about something else entirely. And that scared her more than anything. The days that followed settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. Mikki still felt like an outsider, a guest in a life that didn't belong to her. But the unease she had carried that first night had started to fade. She spent most of her time with Lyra not because she had to, but because the little girl always seemed to find her. Whether it was in the sunlit reading nook by the windows or the quiet corners of the garden, Lyra would appear, watching her with cautious, curious eyes, waiting for Mikki to acknowledge her before stepping closer. And every time Mikki did, she realized something. Although she had never considered herself particularly patient, with Lyra it came naturally. She didn't try to force words out of her. She didn't demand that she open up, she just existed beside her. And somehow, that was enough. One afternoon, as they sat outside beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, Lyra slowly slid a notebook toward Mikki. Mikki raised a brow. For me, Lyra nodded, watching her carefully. Mikki opened it, expecting blank pages. Instead, she found delicate, careful drawings. Flowers, trees, a small house with a single window lit up in yellow. A slow smile spread across her face as she flipped through the pages. "Did you draw all these?" Lyra hesitated, then gave a small nod. "They're really good," Mikki said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Meaning you've got talent, kid." A tiny flicker of pride crossed Lyra's face. Mikki traced a finger over one of the drawings, her chest tightening. "You remind me of my mom," she murmured, more to herself than to Lyra. "She used to draw too. All the time." Lyra's fingers tightened slightly around her pencil, her expression unreadable. Mikki cleared her throat, shutting the notebook carefully. "Maybe you can teach me sometime. I was always terrible at drawing. My stick figures barely look like people." Lyra's lips twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Later that evening, Mikki found herself in the kitchen, absent-mindedly helping Julia chop vegetables for dinner. It was strange how natural it felt, standing there like she belonged. Despite knowing she didn't, Julia glanced at her with mild amusement. "I have to say, dear, you're settling in better than I expected," Mikki scoffed. "Don't get used to it. I'm still figuring things out." Julia nodded knowingly. "That's how it always starts." Mikki rolled her eyes, but couldn't fight the small smile tugging at her lips. Reece walked in then, sleeves rolled up, phone in hand. He looked tired, which was rare for him. Reece Bailey was the kind of man who always seemed in control, always composed, but tonight there was something heavier in his expression. He set his phone down on the counter and ran a hand through his hair. Mikki glanced at him. "Rough day at the Billionaire Club?" Reece exhaled through his nose, smirking despite himself. "Something like that." Julia handed him a glass of whiskey without asking, and he took it gratefully, taking a slow sip before leaning against the counter. Mikki studied him for a moment before deciding to just ask, "You going to tell me what you found out?" His grip on the glass tightened slightly, but his expression didn't waver. "I said I would," he replied, still waiting. Reece sighed, setting his drink down. "Not here." Mikki's stomach clenched. That didn't sound good. They moved to his office, the heavy doors closing behind them, sealing them in. Mikki had never been in here before. The room was lined with dark bookshelves, floor to ceiling, their spines perfectly arranged. A massive desk sat in the center, papers stacked in neat, precise piles, a space built for order and control. She crossed her arms, leaning against one of the chairs. "So," Reece exhaled, running a hand over his face before finally looking at her. "I had someone dig into your mother's past," he admitted. And I found something you need to know. Mikki's throat went dry. What? He hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Your mother didn't just die in an accident, he said finally. Mikki's breath caught. She was there, Mikki. Reece's voice was measured, but there was something raw underneath. The night of the crash that killed Emmy. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. What? She whispered, barely able to get the word out. Reece held her gaze. She was there. His next words sent her world tilting sideways. And she saved Lyra's life? Silence. Mikki's pulse roared in her ears. That doesn't make sense, she stammered. My mom? She shook her head. No, she never even knew you. I don't think that's true. Reece's voice was quiet, certain. She pulled Lyra from the car before it caught fire. Mikki felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. She what? Reece exhaled. The paramedics confirmed it. She was the one who saved her. Mikki's hands clenched at her sides. Her mother, the woman she had spent years grieving, the woman she had thought she had lost forever, had been there. Had saved Lyra. But why? Her voice was barely a whisper. But why? Reece's jaw tightened. That's what I'm trying to find out. Mikki's chest ached. Her mother had died that night, that much she had always known, but she had never known why she was there, why she had been anywhere near that crash. And now, the missing pieces were starting to come together in a way that terrified her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at Reece. Did she say anything? Mikki's voice was barely above a whisper. Did she leave a message? Reece's expression darkened, his voice quieter. Yes. Mikki's breath caught. She didn't realize she was holding it until he spoke again, and when he did, the words changed everything. Do good, even if no one sees. A shudder ran through Mikki, because she knew those words. They weren't random, they weren't meaningless. They were her mother's words, the words she had said to Mikki since she was a child, since she had been old enough to understand that doing the right thing wasn't always rewarded. They were the words her mother had lived by, and now they were the last thing she had left behind. Mikki turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead as she tried to breathe. Reece stayed quiet, giving her space. When she finally turned back around, her voice was steadier than she felt. What does this mean? Reece exhaled. It means our lives were connected long before we ever met. Mikki's pulse pounded. Nothing would ever be the same again. The walls of Reece's office seemed to close in around her as the truth settled deep in her bones. Her mother had been there the night Emmy died. She had saved Lyra. And she had left a message meant for her, words Mikki had carried her entire life. Words that had once been a guiding light, now felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. She stood there, staring blankly, as the same questions echoed in her mind. Why was she at that crash? Did she know Emmy? Did she know Reece? Had it been chance? Or was there something more? Her pulse roared in her ears as she forced herself to meet his gaze. What else do you know? Reece studied her carefully before responding. Not much yet, but I'm looking. That's not good enough, she snapped, her voice tight, her emotions pushing past the carefully built walls she had spent years maintaining. I know, he said, his voice frustratingly calm. But this isn't something I can rush. There are gaps in the story, pieces missing. Mikki clenched her fists. You don't get it, do you? Her voice cracked and she hated the way it made her sound. Too raw, too exposed, as if the ground beneath her was slipping. This isn't just some puzzle for you to solve. This is my mother, my life. Reece exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the desk. I do get it. Mikki let out a humorless laugh. Right, because you're so good at dealing with things emotionally. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't bite back. Instead, he ran a hand over his face, looking as exhausted as she felt. I don't have all the answers, Mikki, but I promise you, I'm going to find them. The sincerity in his voice made her want to believe him, but belief had never come easily to her. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her brain. I need some air. Reece didn't stop her as she turned and walked out of the office, but she felt his gaze on her heavy, with something she wasn't ready to name. The crisp evening air wrapped around her as she stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The garden stretched out in front of her, perfectly manicured, bathed in the soft glow of outdoor lights. Everything about this place was too perfect, too controlled. Just like Reece, and just like that, she felt it again. The weight of knowing that her life had somehow been tangled with his long before she had ever stepped into this house. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Lyra stood in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit dangling from her hand, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Mikki forced herself to push aside her turmoil and managed a small smile. "Hey, kiddo, couldn't sleep?" Lyra shook her head. Mikki crouched down so they were at eye level. "Me neither." The little girl hesitated before stepping closer, her wide eyes searching Mikki's face. Mikki exhaled, her voice quieter now. "Do you ever get that feeling? Like something big is happening, and you don't know if you're ready for it?" Lyra didn't respond. She didn't need to. There was understanding in her gaze, a quiet recognition that made Mikki's chest ache. And then, after a long moment, Lyra reached out and took Mikki's hand, small and warm against hers. Mikki swallowed hard. It wasn't fair. Lyra had already lost so much. She had been through more than any child should ever have to endure, and now Mikki was terrified. Terrified that whatever truth was waiting for them on the other side of this mystery was going to break something neither of them could fix. But for now, she let herself hold Lyra's hand. Rounding herself in the one thing she knew for certain, she wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Mikki found herself in the library, pacing restlessly as she tried to make sense of everything. She was tired. Tired of unanswered questions, tired of the past creeping in like a ghost she couldn't outrun. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. A moment later, Julia walked in, carrying a tray of tea and pastries. Because, of course, she did, the woman had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was falling apart and needed something warm to hold. Julia set the tray down on the side table with quiet precision. "Thought you could use this." Mikki let out a dry chuckle. "Is it that obvious?" Julia smiled knowingly. "A little," Mikki sighed, sinking into a chair. "How do you do it?" Julia tilted her head. "Stay so calm when everything around you is unraveling?" Julia chuckled as she poured tea into a delicate porcelain cup. "Years of practice, and the knowledge that life has a way of revealing what we need to know, whether we're ready for it or not." Mikki sank into a chair with a heavy sigh, taking the cup Julia offered her. "I don't know if I want to know." Julia gave her a gentle look. "Yes, you do, otherwise it wouldn't be eating at you like this." Mikki took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "What if I find out something I can't handle?" Julia tilted her head. "Then you handle it anyway, because that's what strong people do." Mikki exhaled, feeling anything but strong. More like a fraud. A woman standing in a life that wasn't hers, waiting for it to collapse beneath her. But she knew Julia was right. No matter what she discovered, she couldn't turn away. Not now. Setting her cup aside, she stood with a resolve hardened by necessity. She needed answers, and she was going to find them. The questions, the missing pieces, and the nagging feeling that something had been kept from her for years were clawing at her mind, refusing to let go. For as long as she could remember, Mikki had never known why her mother had died that night. Why the explanation was always shrouded in vague phrases like wrong place, wrong time, or just an accident. But if Reece was right, it wasn't just an accident. Her mother had been there, saving Lyra and leaving behind a message meant for Mikki. The truth was elusive, and she needed to know it. That afternoon, while Reece was away handling business in the city, Mikki found herself standing outside his office, her hands curled into fists. She had promised herself she wouldn't snoop, that he would tell her everything when he was ready. But patience had never been her strong suit. With a determined push, she opened the door and stepped inside, her pulse quickening as she took in the meticulously organized desk, the shelves lined with books and files, the quiet hum of a space belonging to a man who controlled every detail of his life. Except this. She moved toward the desk, scanning its surface. Everything appeared in order. No loose papers, no open folders. Then her eyes landed on a small, locked drawer near the bottom. Instinct told her that what she was looking for was there. For only a second, she hesitated before pulling at the handle. Of course it was locked. Frustration burned in her chest. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a small key resting on a nearby shelf, tucked behind a framed photo of Lyra. Her heart pounding, she reached for it, slid it into the lock and turned. With a quiet click, the drawer opened. Inside lay a single file. Mikki pulled it out carefully, unfolding the documents with trembling fingers. The first thing she saw was a photograph, a grainy image of a car wreck, flames licking the night sky, debris scattered across the pavement. Her stomach twisted painfully. Beneath the photograph were hospital records and police reports. She skimmed through them quickly until she found it. A witness statement, with her mother's name printed at the top, clear as day. In that moment, everything shifted. Mikki's breath caught as she read the words, "I saw the crash happen. I pulled the little girl from the back seat before the flames reached her. I didn't see the driver until it was too late." Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted to the next line, and when she read it, a shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't an accident. Someone forced them off the road. Her hand shook. "Someone forced them off the road," she whispered, barely able to say it aloud. Her mother had known. She flipped the page, scanning frantically for more. Another report, an update, anything, but there was nothing. No follow-up, no investigation, just a witness statement buried in the endless bureaucracy of paperwork, left to be forgotten. Her pulse roared in her ears. Had Reece seen this? Did he know? Before she could process, before she could even breathe, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic shot through her. She shoved the file back into the drawer, locked it, and returned the key to its place just as the door swung open. Reece stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His gaze flicked from her to the desk. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, "You were looking for something," he said, his voice measured. Mikki crossed her arms, meeting his eyes. "You're investigating my mother's death," she said evenly, "but you didn't tell me that she thought it wasn't an accident." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe. "I wasn't ready to tell you that," he admitted. Mikki clenched her jaw. "You should have been," Reece exhaled, stepping further into the room. "I don't have proof yet, just fragments of a story that doesn't make sense." Mikki let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, but I know," she said, voice raw. "I know someone caused that crash." She inhaled sharply. "And no one did anything about it?" Reece didn't argue, didn't try to deny it. His silence was answer enough. Mikki's stomach twisted. "You were there," she said, shaking her head. "You lost your wife in that crash and you never thought to look deeper?" Reece's jaw tightened. "Of course I did." Her hands curled into fists. "Then why is this the first time I'm hearing about it?" His voice was low, steady, but edged with something restrained. "Because I didn't find that report until recently." Mikki's breath hitched. "It was buried," Reece continued. "Lost in old records. No one ever followed up on it. It was just..." His expression darkened. "Forgotten." Mikki swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "So, you're saying..." She exhaled sharply. "Someone wanted it to be forgotten?" Reece didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet and firm. "I think someone made sure it was." The weight of his words settled between them like a heavy fog. Mikki took a slow step back, shaking her head. "Why?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would someone do that?" Reece's gaze held hers, dark, unwavering. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Then she saw it. A name. A signature at the bottom of an old report. One of the few remaining documents from the original investigation. It was barely legible, almost an afterthought among the stacks of bureaucratic paperwork, but it was there. Detective Samuel Grayson Mikki's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" she asked, pointing at the name. Reece leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "Grayson. I've seen that name before." He flipped through the pages, scanning for any other mention of the detective. Then, in a report buried near the back, they found it. A note in the margin, written in messy, hurried handwriting. "Case closed. Lack of evidence. Proceed with caution." Mikki's breath hitched. "Proceed with caution?" she muttered. "What the hell does that mean?" Reece's expression darkened. "It means someone didn't want to push too hard." Mikki clenched her jaw, and now he's the only one who might have answers? Reece nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I'll see if I can track him down." Mikki exhaled, her fingers drumming anxiously against the table. Everything about this case had been swept under the rug, forgotten. But someone had known the truth. Someone had been warned. And now they were going to find out why. Reece stood, pressing the phone to his ear as he walked toward the other room, waiting for someone to pick up. Mikki stared down at the file in front of her. "You knew, didn't you, Mom?" The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Her mother had seen something that night, had tried to tell someone, and instead of being heard, she had been buried along with the truth. Not this time. Mikki took a deep breath, steeling herself. No more secrets. No more waiting. Whoever had tried to erase the truth all those years ago was about to realize they had failed. Shadow Connolly let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. "Because the truth wouldn't have changed anything," he said finally. Mikki's jaw tightened. "You don't get to decide that." Connolly sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, kid." "Don't kid me," she snapped. "The night my mother died, you stood in my house and told me it was an accident. You looked me in the eye and told me it was just an accident." He flinched at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. Reece leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know there was more to it. We know someone forced that car off the road. What we don't know is who or why." Connolly was silent for a long moment, his gaze flicking between them. Then finally he exhaled and leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I was a cop for 30 years, he said slowly. "And in that time, I learned that some cases, they ain't meant to be solved." Mikki's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Connolly hesitated. Then, as if making a decision, he stood and walked over to a cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a small, worn-out notebook. When he returned to his seat, he set it on the coffee table between them. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is what they didn't want you to see." Mikki's fingers trembled as she reached for it. She flipped it open, scanning the yellowed pages. Inside were names, dates, hastily scribbled notes. Some pages had been ripped out, others faded with time. Emmy Bailey. A chill ran down her spine. "What is this?" she murmured. "The real case file," Connolly said. "Not the official one they fed to the department." Reece's gaze darkened. "Who buried it?" Connolly let out a humorless chuckle. "That's the thing, son. The people who buried it, they were the ones supposed to solve it." Mikki's pulse roared in her ears. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that the cops covered it up?" Connolly held her gaze. "I'm telling you," he said carefully, "that some cases, they're made to disappear before they even see the light of day." Mikki gritted her teeth. "Why?" Connolly hesitated again, as if weighing his next words. "Because your mother wasn't just some witness," he finally said. "And Emmy Bailey wasn't just some accident." Reece stiffened beside her. "What the hell does that mean?" Mikki demanded. Connolly sighed. "It means," he said, his voice lower now, "that they were running from something. Or someone." Mikki's breath caught. Her mother, Reece's wife, they had been in the same place, on the same road, the same night, and it hadn't been an accident. Her hands clenched into fists. "Who were they running from?" she asked. Connolly shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" Mikki swallowed hard, flipping through more pages. Then she stopped. There was something else, another name, underlined twice. Nathaniel Blackwood. She looked up, meeting Connolly's gaze. "Who is Nathaniel Blackwood?" she asked. Connolly hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "The man who owned the city," he said. "And the man who would kill to keep it that way." Mikki sat up straighter, her heart pounding. "What?" she pressed. "What did you just remember?" Reece didn't answer right away. His jaw tensed, his fingers curling tighter against his knee. Mikki could see the war waging inside him. Memories he hadn't thought about in years, details he had long since buried, suddenly clawing their way back to the surface. "Reece," she said, her voice quieter now, "if you know anything, now is the time." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Then, finally, he spoke. "There was one night," he admitted, his voice carefully controlled, "a few weeks before the accident." Mikki and Connolly both leaned in, waiting. "She got a phone call," Reece continued, his gaze unfocused, lost in the past. "Late. I remember because we were already in bed and she never answered calls that late unless it was important." Mikki held her breath. "I woke up when she got out of bed. She went into the other room to talk, but..." He hesitated, his brow furrowing. I could tell she was upset. I didn't hear the whole conversation, just bits and pieces. She was whispering. She said something like, "I told you I wanted no part of this." Connolly's expression darkened. "She was scared?" Mikki asked, barely above a whisper. Reece hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." A cold chill ran through her. "What else?" Connolly pushed. Reece exhaled, shaking his head slightly like he was piecing the memory together as he spoke. "I came out and asked who it was, but she hung up before answering. She looked rattled." "I remember that." His fingers twitched. "She told me it was nothing, just an old family argument." Mikki felt her stomach tighten. An old family argument. What if it wasn't just an argument, she murmured. What if she was trying to get away from something? Reece's face darkened. "If she was, she never told me." Connolly let out a long breath. "And you never thought to ask?" Reece shot him a sharp look. "She didn't want me to ask," he snapped. "She brushed it off. She lied to me. If I had known it was something more, He cut himself off. Pressing his lips into a tight line, Mikki saw it then. The regret buried beneath his anger. The weight of what-ifs pressing down on him. "She was protecting you," Mikki realized. Reece's jaw clenched. "She knew something," Connolly said, his voice grave. "Something dangerous enough that she didn't want Reece involved." Mikki's pulse pounded in her ears. "And now we need to find out what." Connolly nodded, sitting back in his chair. "If Emmy's family had something to hide, then they're the ones we need to look at next." Mikki inhaled sharply. For years she had thought her mother's death was a closed chapter, an accident, a tragedy with no deeper meaning. Now, that illusion was shattered, and the only way forward was through the truth, no matter where it led. "What?" she pressed. Reece exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "A few days before she died, she got a phone call," he admitted. "It upset her. I asked her about it, but she brushed it off. Said it was nothing." His fingers curled slightly against his knee. "I should have pushed harder." Mikki swallowed. "Do you know who called her?" Reece shook his head. "No. But if what Connolly is saying is true, then maybe she knew something she wasn't supposed to." Mikki exhaled slowly, trying to steady her thoughts. "And whoever wanted her gone made sure of it." Silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Mikki turned back to Connolly. "You said someone forced them off the road. Do you know who?" Connolly hesitated. For a second, she thought he might not answer. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't know for sure, but there was a name that came up a few times during the early investigation, before everything was shut down." Mikki leaned in. "Who?" Connolly's gaze darkened. "Lucien Holloway." A chill ran down her spine. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Reece stiffened told her everything she needed to know. She turned to him. "You know who that is?" His expression remained unreadable, but his voice was cold. "Yes." Mikki waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. Connolly let out a tired breath. "I don't have proof of anything," he said, "but if you're looking for answers, that's where I'd start." Mikki swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists. "Where can we find him?" Connolly shook his head. "No one's seen him in years. He disappeared after the crash. Some say he left the country, others say he's dead." He exhaled, his voice grim. "But if he's alive, someone knows where he is." Reece stood abruptly, his movements sharp, controlled. "Then I'll find him." Mikki followed suit, still trying to catch up with everything that had just been dropped on them. "And when we do?" Reece turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We find out the truth." Mikki nodded. But deep down, she felt a gnawing sense of unease. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. This was bigger. This was dangerous, and she had the sinking feeling that once they found Lucien Holloway, there would be no turning back. The drive back to the city was silent. Reece gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched, lost in his own thoughts. Mikki stared out the window, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented truths and unanswered questions. Finally, she broke the silence. "Who is he?" Reece didn't look at her. "He worked for my father-in-law?" Mikki's breath hitched. "Emmy's father?" She turned to him. "So you think he was involved?" Reece's grip on the wheel tightened. "I don't know," he said, his voice measured. "But I intend to find out." Mikki exhaled slowly, her chest tightening. If Emmy's family had been involved in covering up the truth, then her mother hadn't just died, She had been silenced. She had died protecting Lyra. Mikki clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let her mother's death be just another forgotten tragedy. "I'm going to find Lucien Holloway," her voice was steady, "and I'm going to make sure the truth finally comes to light." Mikki's breath caught. She turned to Reece, her pulse hammering. "Where?" Reece's expression was unreadable, but there was something steely in his eyes. "An old contact of mine traced him to a town just outside the city. He's been keeping a low profile off the grid." Mikki exhaled, steadying herself. "And he's alive?" Reece gave a sharp nod. "For now." A chill ran through her. "For now." Lyra watched them silently, her wide eyes taking in everything. Mikki knelt beside her, brushing a hand over her soft curls. "I'll be back soon, okay?" The little girl nodded but didn't let go of her hand right away. Mikki squeezed gently before standing. Reece was already heading toward the door, his movements controlled, but she could see the tension simmering beneath the surface. They drove in silence, the weight of what was coming hanging heavy between them. Mikki stared out the window, her thoughts a tangled mess. Lucien Holloway. The name felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. Reece's father-in-law had power, connections. He could have made this all disappear, and yet Holloway had vanished instead. Was he running? Hiding? Or had he been waiting? Mikki swallowed hard. When they found him, there would be no more secrets, no more hiding, no more lies. Reece tightened his grip on the wheel as they turned onto a narrow, winding road leading into a rundown part of town. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. Mikki nodded, her heart pounding. They pulled up to an old, abandoned-looking house on the outskirts. The paint was peeling, the front yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like the kind of place people forgot existed. Reece killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a slow, measured breath, Reece pushed open the door, and Mikki followed. The porch creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it. Reece knocked, firm and deliberate. Silence. Then a shuffling sound from inside. Mikki tensed. A few heartbeats later, the door cracked open. A man stood there, half hidden in the shadows. His face was lined with age, his hair graying at the edges, his eyes, sharp, calculating, narrowed when they met Reece. And then he saw Mikki. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, fear. Lucien Holloway had been expecting them. And that terrified her more than anything. The cabin felt smaller now, the air too thick, too heavy with the weight of what had just been said. Mikki's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, grounding herself. Emmy's father. He was the one behind everything. Her mother's death, the cover-up, the silence that had stretched on for years. Reece was frozen beside her, his body tense, his breathing measured. But Mikki knew this silence wasn't control, it was rage. Lucien Holloway sighed, watching them both. "Now you know," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "What are you going to do about it?" Mikki swallowed, the fire burning in her throat. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm not letting him get away with it." Holloway let out a dry chuckle. "And what exactly do you plan to do? He's not just some man you can expose in the papers and expect justice. Men like him, they own justice." Reece finally spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then we take everything away from him." Holloway exhaled, leaning back. "You really don't get it, do you?" His gaze flickered to Mikki. "Your mother tried to stand up to him. She tried to do the right thing, and look where it got her." Mikki's chest ached, but she ignored the doubt creeping in. "I'm not my mother," she said, her voice like steel. Holloway tilted his head. "No, but you're just as stubborn. And that's going to get you killed." Mikki set her jaw. "We'll see about that." She turned to Reece. "We need more. We need proof." Reece gave a single nod, his expression still unreadable. "We'll get it." Holloway sighed again, rubbing his temples as if already regretting what he was about to say. "If you're serious about this, there's only one place you'll find what you need." Mikki's breath caught. "Where?" Holloway hesitated, then finally said, "Emmy's father kept records. He's careful, but not perfect. If there's anything tying him to that crash, anything, it'll be in his private files." Reece's gaze sharpened. "Where?" Holloway exhaled. "His estate. Big, heavily guarded, and locked down tighter than a damn government facility. Mikki's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to focus. Then we get inside. Holloway laughed under his breath. You really are crazy. Mikki gave him a sharp smile. No, I'm just done being afraid. Holloway shook his head, muttering something under his breath, but he didn't argue. Reece finally turned toward the door. We're done here. Mikki followed, her heart beat a steady drum against her ribs. She knew the risks, she knew the danger, but she also knew this. She wasn't walking away. Not this time. Not until she burned the whole house down. Mikki stepped out of the cabin, her resolve solidifying with every breath. The world outside was darkening, but she wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. There was no going back, no retreating into the comfort of ignorance. They had the truth now, and there was only one path forward. Reece stood beside her, silent but present, his eyes locked onto the horizon, as if already planning their next move. Mikki turned to him, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything they'd just learned. We're going to bring everything to light. No more secrets. Reece's jaw tightened, but his gaze was unwavering. We do this, Mikki. There's no turning back. Everything changes. She nodded, the air thick with the promise of what was to come. There were risks, dangers, people who would stop at nothing to protect their power. But she was ready. They were both ready. As they walked back toward the car, Mikki felt something shift inside her. A fire that had been smoldering for years, now burning bright. This was just the beginning. And whatever came next, she would face it head on. The truth was waiting, and nothing would stop her from finding it. To be continued. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And hey, there's another video just popping up on your screen right now. Click it to keep following heartwarming stories that will touch your soul. Stay tuned for more.